So any questions?
Will you put up your
I think it's gone now.
That's right.
Yeah. Okay.
You had gold at the bottom.
Yeah.
And you had all these other different types of debts above it. We don't have, and we haven't had gold in our system for a long time now. But it still has worked for 100 years, and I guess this is part of why we've come today. How can it work for 100 years without gold being the standard?
That's a very good question. Let's just see how long it lasts. I mean, that's all really.
It's not 100 years, it's only 50 since Nixon cut the last chop of the leg. Gold was in the system,
40.
Isolated, but...
40.
40? There's my math for you. The mathematician would know how many years, but it's not 100, I can tell that much.
No, but that's not the case, because every time it became a problem, they just changed the gold rule, you know? So as soon as they got off it...
I think you can argue that it would have failed in fashion in 2008. Because, you know, when you issue paper with no intention of ever repaying it, and you base the deposit system of the financial system on that paper, in 2008 that would have all come crashing down. So anyone that had a deposit with any bank would have seen that deposit written down to zero. The Royal Bank of Scotland was 30 minutes away from having all cash machines shut down during the crisis, before the Bank of England came in. So I think that, you know, if the governments didn't do what they did and just allowed the system to do what it would have done, it would have been the end, you know.
As soon as you walk away from gold and you have these other systems, then even if we're stuck with gold in the standard, you would still run that same risk, wouldn't you?
You would still run that same risk, you know, because in the example I gave, you know, the villager made a mistake, but you can limit the extent to the damage that mistake would inflict on the rest of the system, though. Nothing is perfect. Nothing is perfect, because this. I didn't explain this picture. Here you got the gold sovereign. You got the thing which is closest to the gold, which is the bill, and you've got clothes, detergents, fruit, canned goods here, and then you've got jet planes, houses, motor cars, ships and boats there, and then on the very highest you've got spacecraft, stadia, chemical plants, you know, things which take a lot longer to build. You know, people make mistakes when they undertake these enterprises, you know. So there's an element of responsibility from both people, obviously, the borrower and the lender, I think.
But you could certainly argue, though, that you said, well, it all would have come down in 2008. That's presupposing that 2008 would have actually occurred. Because if it was on a gold standard, then if it had been kept the way the gold standard is supposed to be kept...
Yeah, it would never have got there in the first place. Yeah. You know, you would be paying... In 2008, assuming we still have this system, and for some perverse reason it still keeps on expanding, you'd be paying 15%, you know, for anything, to borrow money for anything. And if you can find productive endeavour, like a lot of people don't realise, but call rates during the 20s for margin loans went up massively. You know, you were paying about 13-14% just before the 29 crash. So some similar form of self-correcting mechanism would have happened way before 2008 would have been allowed to happen, I think.
I really liked your expose. And again, I guess it's a feature of Hungarian economics, or what the New Austrian School of Economics advocates or teaches, that it's the individuals that are responsible for their own actions, as opposed to, in your village, representation of planet Earth. There's no central bank.
Yeah.
There's no central authority that dictates what the interest rate should be, or this and that and the other. And you make a mistake, you go bankrupt, or you don't get paid back, or whatever. So, is that essentially what the essence of the problem is today? That it's we can say that we don't have sound money because we're not on a gold standard, of course. But we could also say, couldn't we?
Yeah.
That we could, not be on a gold standard and just not have such. Is that right? Not have.
The way I say it is, what's the point in wearing a white shirt if you've got a dirty body? There's no point in going back to a gold standard if banks are still borrowing short to lend long, because you'll go into some kind of crisis and they'll blame it on the gold standard again. When it has nothing to do with the gold standard.
Yeah, which brings the question to mind, which is what would need to happen with our current financial system first before we can go back to a proper gold standard. My understanding, limited understanding of this, is that debts have to be settled somehow beforehand. Is that the case, or what needs to happen,
Professor?
Before we can conceptually? You can't just go back to a gold standard. There's too much unsettled promises.
And there is this resistance, to say the least, to a gold standard on the part of special interest groups who have vested interest in maintaining the regime of irredeemable paper currency. So I'm going to say more about that in the future lectures during this symposium. But let's say right now that my thinking has changed quite considerably during the past year or two, because I was one of those categorical theories to say either gold standard or nothing. I don't see it that way anymore. I see a possibility of gold coins and paper money, banknotes, irredeemable banknotes, can be made to compete. And I think mostly everybody in this room would agree that gold coins would win hands down. I mean, if you have a choice of accepting payments in irredeemable promises, which essentially a paper banknote is, it promises to pay you nothing. By custom, people still accept it in trade, so you can buy goods and services, but basically there's no contract behind, because it doesn't, the banknote does not promise you anything, and the issuing authority does not hold any reserves against that, except for another promise. But things could be so bad that all promises will be worthless, all of them. Government and the next neighborhood grocery store, no difference. People, when it comes to running for their life, they're not going to be impressed by so-called lenders of last resort and such dubious contract. So, why don't we change our strategy and force the issuers of irredeemable paper to compete with gold in an open market? So that means you have to bring gold coins out of hiding, and that's a big problem. But I think it can be handled. And the way to handle it is I am advocating this slogan, open the mint to gold. This means that, for example, in the United States, by constitutional obligation, the government has to maintain a mint and keep it open to gold, which means it's the people who decide how much gold coins will go into circulation, because if not enough does, then they could melt down old jewelry or take newly mined gold to the mint and have it converted into coins. So it's not the bankers, neither are they elected officials, but it's the people themselves. If they think there's too little money, they take gold to the mint and convert it into gold coins of the realm. So, and there's an incentive, because throughout most of history, the coined gold had a slight premium in the order of 2, 3, 4, 5% over gold in bullion form. So people who have bullion can help themselves to a capital gain in the order of a couple of percent, not much, but that's highly liquid. You see, that's the important thing. Gold as an asset is not just an asset which has to compete in the marketplace with all the other assets, but gold is a unique thing, the most liquid form of wealth. So if you increase your liquid wealth by 2%, it means far more than increasing your total wealth by 2 or the same percentage. Because you don't have the problem of liquidating your asset. Any other form of asset, if you want to avail yourself to it, you have to sell it first. And that could be a big problem, because illiquidity means either a relatively high loss, which you take when you sell, or it would take an inordinate length of time. And by the time you sell, your new business opportunity has disappeared. So I want to warn those of you who might just say that, well, 2-3%, why would people go to the trouble and take their gold to the mint and take the coins back? It's not worth it. And the answer is yes, it is. If you are in business and you want to cut your losses to the bare minimum, then you would do it. So if the government opens the mint to gold, there will be a flow of gold. Gold will be attracted from around the world, really, and they will find, or trying to find, a coin form. So in answer to your question, I would suggest that this is a big, big threshold to go from paper money to gold. But my own thinking, and I'm still mulling it over in my mind, that this should not be thought of as a discontinuous jump, but rather a smooth transition. And we are supremely confident that our instrument, the gold coin and silver coin, would prevail. And let those central bankers who issue paper money be put on notice that it's not a free ride for them anymore.
Yes,
I mean,
Professor, what's the likelihood of that happening? I mean, they're not, you know, they know gold is the enemy.
well, I'm sure the government of New Zealand, if we found the proper channels to it, would perhaps consider it and open the mint to gold, because they have the right approach and the right ideological background. But of course, if a big country like China would do it, or somehow you could persuade the government of the United States that do it now because next day it will be China, and then you lose your monetary leadership in the world forever, which is the way things are. The United States is at the verge of losing whatever monetary leadership it could build up in 200 years or longer, would lose in one day if China said, we are going to monetize silver, open them into silver, or open them into gold, or open them into both. Would be a devastating defeat for the United States government. The trouble is that the media is not saying anything remotely approximating this. And if I put on a paper on the internet, nobody in the US government will ever read it.
I agree that if somebody has a choice of accepting gold or accepting paper, they want gold. The question is, Gresham's law says the person who has the person who's paying, if he has a choice between paying in paper or paying in gold, doesn't he usually choose to pay in paper? How do you get the payer to want to pay in gold, or is there an industry or a particular business that has the pricing power to say, pay in gold or go away?
Comes down to the legal.
Well, it's a
Even if it wasn't a legal tender law.
If there wasn't a legal tender law, it would be easy.
If I had a business, I would say gold only.
Yeah.
You have a business, and you haven't said that.
No, I'm not at that stage yet, though. It might be quite close.
We're all participants in the system.
Yeah.
If we want customers, we have to meet where the customer wants to be. If the customer wants to pay in paper, it's very difficult to say, you will pay me in gold.
well, it sounds like
it's
a
also illegal, isn't it?
Yes.
That's what the legal tender law means.
It would be illegal to insist on being paid only in gold at the moment because there are legal tender laws.
I don't think it's necessary. I don't think so. By the way, you read in various history books of monetary history that gold had legal tender protection just as much as paper money. But this is not true. Nobody has ever refused to be paid in gold if he was willing to. You know, in other words...
But the point is, people may refuse to pay in gold, not to be paid in gold.
I think it sounds like a valid question, but I think in fact it's more complicated than that. If you run a system where you have to make periodic payments, then you have to have an inventory of the medium of payment, what represents purchasing power. And you are going to use it to pay wages, for instance, or to pay your suppliers. You don't create the money out of nothing at the moment when you have to make the payment. You just have to have, if it's not banks, then your own treasury or other industries will spring up to provide for that need. And that is where gold will show its advantage. Because if you have an inventory of medium of payment, which you keep on hand because your payroll is coming up and you have to pay wages, or your suppliers' bills will come due and you have to pay them, then that's the real question to ask. Is it to your advantage as an entrepreneur to carry an inventory of means of exchange in the form of paper money, or is it in gold? And I think here it's easier to see that gold has tremendous advantage, because in comparison with any paper currency, foreign exchange, or what have you, gold has a stable value, and the paper instruments fluctuate. Now, you don't want to carry your purchasing power in a fluctuating media, or even if you have future markets to compensate or hedge or what have you. This is not the same. Gold has a natural stability of value, and therefore you are always in the best position to raise whatever purchasing media you want to use. I mean, your question is justified, because it could be that you as an industrialist or as an entrepreneur prefer to pay wages in paper money. However, this doesn't mean that your inventory is kept in paper money. This is the distinction which we have to make, because I think I can make a very good case that the best, well, let's put it this way. We use the word hedging. Okay, you have wages, payroll to come up, which you have to pay. And you decided, and the labor unions agreed to it, that you paid them in paper money. So this is a liability coming up, not an immediate liability, but a future liability. So you want to hedge that liability. Would you hedge it using another or the same paper currency? I would say, if you study the question on its own merit, you will see that hedging in gold inventory, or some kind of instrument which matures in gold, will be the proper hedge. Hedging paper with paper is a foolish idea. That's what I could mention. Perhaps there are some other opinions.
You know, recently the Mexican drug cartel was busted. They kept their wealth in US dollars instead of gold. Isn't that show Gresham's law? Drug cartels don't comply with the legal tender law, but they would rather keep their wealth in US dollars, stacks and stacks of it in the
So drug cartels, what? Because they keep their balances in US dollars. You know,
for now, for most people, they don't actually know the value of gold. If you go to the common people, they don't.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
They don't know the merits of it. So if we were to go to a competing currency, it would take a few years for people to get used to it, right? Because
Very true.
my generation have absolutely no idea what gold is.
I agree with them. I agree. Philip?
I could just make a comment on that, Lee, which is that I lived in South America, in Colombia for a while, and I always keep up with info there because it interests me. I really like that part of the world. And that's actually not true now. Not so true now. It's still very liquid. They used to keep houseloads of cash. They are moving more and more into gold now. Not just in Colombia, coming north to Mexico, but also going further south as well, down in Paraguay. It's more and more gold, less and less US dollars. So there is an awareness even in that area. In fact, in Colombia, apparently, it's an incredible awareness.
And, well, can I just add to that? There's an interesting case where, for quite a number of years, growing of cocoa has been a significant income for some of these farmers. They've actually found gold up in the hills, and they've started to mine that gold, and they're getting a higher reward than they were from the cocoa. They know very well where their bread's buttered on. These are simple peasants up in the
But to mine gold would be to generate an income, whereas to store your money in gold would be to recognize gold value instead of the US dollar would be different.
I think you'll find they're going hand in glove. They're not only in Colombia as well. They're very heavily moving into gold mining. I just read that quite just in the last few days. But they are also storing now wealth in gold. Not just probably US dollars as well. I'm not that closely.
You know that Sprott is talking to silver miners to store their wealth in the form of silver. This idea is spreading more and more. And Louis, one thing about this buying and selling is when the buyer absolutely positively must have what he wants at any cost, that they will buy with gold. For example, if the Americans need oil and they can't buy it with paper and they can't nuke them, then they're going to have to buy it with gold. But somebody has to say, no gold, no oil, or something.
Well, whenever that's attempted, countries invaded. That's the history so far with Gaddafi, for example.
Absolutely.
So it's not going to be easy.
Any more questions?
Yeah, I just want to make a comment on Professor was saying about actually legally a lot of people can pay in gold. Actually, in Malaysia is when somebody, let's say they want to pay in gold coin, the central bank didn't take action. They actually just say, oh, it's just bartering. You know, you want to buy something in exchange for gold coin, they're bartering. So they didn't actually take action to stop the thing. They consider as a contract between you and me. You're selling me a car, I'm giving you a coin. Give me a chicken, I give you a duck. Something like that. So I don't know about other countries.
Some U.S. states have passed legal tender laws within the state that silver or gold are legal tender in that state, like Utah, for example. And this is spreading out. So there's a lot of pressure from the law. And I don't know if you heard, the American Sheriff's Association is starting to resist a federal invasion into their territory because sheriffs in the U.S. are elected and federales are not elected. So there's a lot of boiling steam under this lid. And like the California legal marijuana laws, that as a medicinal stuff you're allowed to smoke it and so on, but the federals are raiding these places regardless, breaking California law. And now the California legislature is saying, wait a minute, you're breaking our laws. This is something's got to happen.
Well, there's also the interesting scenario, I think it's in New Mexico, where there's a gas station there which says one dime or one nickel for a gallon of gas.
One silver dime.
Yeah, and the kicker on that is it's got to be pre-1965.
Yeah.
Well, somebody was saying to me, well, you know, you can pay in cash or gold. I'd say, okay, what's the discount for gold?
Exactly. I think I might offer some kind of discount for gold for my gold basis service. Many of you are subscribers here. We'll figure out how you get the gold to me later on.
You can't pay you.
I'll store it for you in the U.S. I'll give some people warehouse receipts.
Give me a way.
But don't worry, I don't print too many of those.
Any more questions?
Yeah, just you use the term high order money in the lectures. Those things in a modern term, does it include those derivatives like CDO and MBS?
No. A professor and I had a bit of a discussion on the plane about what you call higher order money, because it's a bit of a misnomer, because there's nothing. It has monetary characteristics, but it's not money. But you have to have an air of, not just an air, but you have to be honest in your dealings. You have to be an honest individual for that piece of paper to retain its value. So in a sense, it is a higher order form of money, because if you just find a lump of gold on the ground, that's it, you've found money. But if you find a chit on the ground, it only has value if the parties to either side of it are still existent, still conversant, still willing to, liquidate the liability at the end of the day. But M1, M2, M3, that is meant to be the representation of this.
I recommended using the term marketability of monetary instruments, because definitely the instruments you are talking about is not money, but it has some characteristics of money. And if you want to be able to compare different types of monetary instruments, which takes into consideration not only the maturity, obviously, the shorter the maturity, the better the monetary instrument is. But there are other qualities of monetary qualities which a monetary instrument may or may not have. Then you introduce the term the marketability of the monetary instrument. And this is straight from Menger, because the marketability is measured by a spread. Each of these monetary instruments have a market. If they don't have a market, they don't have value either. But let's assume that they do have value, and therefore they do have a market. And the market will quote not one price, but two prices, the ask price and the bid price. So there is a spread. This is known as the bid-ask spread. Now, question, what is the higher quality of instrument? The one for which the spread is wide, or the one for which the spread is smaller?
Smaller.
Small. Small is the greater marketability. And you can refine this further, because don't think of the spread as being monolithic either. The price is not monolithic, because the spread is the better indicator. But really it's a function, because obviously if you trade in very large quantities, the spread is going to widen. So what are we talking about? Well, we are comparing the variation of the spread. We agree that all spreads for the various monetary instruments will get wider if we trade larger and larger quantities. But then you can compare the rate at which the spread widens for monetary instrument A, and then you measure the same thing for monetary instrument B. So whichever spread widens at the lower rate will have the higher marketability, and therefore you would call it, what is your term?
Higher order money.
Higher degree money.
Higher order.
Higher order money. Yeah, I have a little bit of quarrel with this higher order, because higher order means really less marketability. And normally you would prefer the higher marketability. So that's just a little remark I want to put across, that Menger's idea of marketability, straight from his concept of spread, is going to answer that question too.
But language is so important. The terms that are used. I mean, it's not a coincidence they call it higher order money. It's part of the deception. It's,
I was wondering.
There's no coincidence.
I was wondering myself.
I mean, one would expect that spreads up here would be wider than for spreads, down here. But then this instrument up here actually makes a journey. It goes from here to here to here, and then eventually to here. So the spread of that instrument would change as its maturity. You have to think of this as like a convection current, with gold heating it at the bottom.
In a proper system.
Yeah, in a proper system.
Yes.
The system we have now. But all I can say is that if the way that you should view it is, if an alien is observing planet Earth and looking at the monetary system, the alien should say, God, what the hell are the people like behind it then? Because that will be, and you see all kinds of disgusting characters in finance, like the Rothschilds, and people like that. So
you can criticise the Rothschild, but you could also argue if it wasn't for the Rothschilds, then the British wouldn't have had gold to back Wellington. It would never have defeated Napoleon, and we would all be speaking French.
Ce n'est pas un problème.
That would be a bad thing.
Depends on your just perspective, I think.
Absolutely.
The best we have elections.
Oh dear. But one point you made in your lecture, Sandy, was that there is no intention to pay. And that is the problem today. And it amazes me every time I present to investment professionals and I have a slide about the US debt and I point out that not a single dollar has been redeemed since 1961. They all look bemused. Huh? Really? Because it's just, a new bond is issued, and they just service the debt. Even that is becoming questionable. But, what is at the very base of portfolio construction out there as the risk-free investment, the U.S. Treasuries, well, they've never been paid back for 50 years.
And they have to borrow money to pay interest.
Exactly, and they're quite happy to still fund I won't say it, those guys for 2% in 10 years. So it's really quite mind-boggling, and I couldn't help but think of that when Professor Yu said that 2% is quite significant when you don't want to lose anything.
When the marketability is low, the 2% is worth more than if the marketability is high.
And this is precisely what's going on and why people are quite, well, not free markets, but, U.S. Treasuries are still bought for less than 2% today.
And I would be one who would say just be very, very careful, because there is a lot of vitality in the US dollar still because of that misconception. Don't underestimate. I mean, the facts and figures give you a very sorry picture for the US dollar. But when you take human psychology and factor it in, picture changes. There is such a thing as inertia in financial markets. The US dollar has this inertia, partly because of the volume and partly because of the speed with which the US dollar balances circulate in the world. So those, you read that on the internet, these websites predict the collapse of the US dollar in months, or some of them in weeks. Forget it. Forget it. It's not like that. It doesn't work like it. Never did. Never did. I mean, those guys at the U.S. Federal Reserve and U.S. Treasury really have to work very hard to try to beat down the international value of the dollar with sludge hammers. I don't believe that they are making the interest rate low. I think they want to raise it because low interest also suggests solidity of value, whereas high interest, increasing in loss of value. They would like to see interest rates somewhat higher. And they know they cannot fine-tune it, but the feature of falling interest rates is built into the system. It is owing to a large part to bond speculators who work ways out to make their bond speculation risk-free. They are primary buyers of the bonds as it is issued, and they know how to dump it and when to dump it into the lap of the Federal Reserve. So it's a risk-free profit. Now, when you are up against somebody who gambles risk-free, then you better stand aside, because you have no chance. It's like you never sit down with at a card game when you know that some of your partners are
crooks.
Yeah, or playing with dice. If you know that some of the dice are loaded, you don't sit down and play dice. And that's something similar to this one. These bond speculators, and some of them are banks, some of them are Goldman Sachs or JP Morgan, they know exactly what they are doing, and most people out there in the market, they haven't got the foggiest idea what they are doing. So it's going to be very messy and very difficult, very complicated. Don't take anything for granted, not even the weakness and the congenital disease of the US dollar cannot be taken for granted. There's a lot of psychology going into it. Of course, at one point, it snaps. Confidence snaps. It's somewhat elastic, but there is a point where it will break. And once this happens, all bets are taken off. But as long as the confidence is still there, and it obviously is, it's very dangerous to bet against the dollar or treasury bonds. Interest rates are going to go up. It has to, because of the fundamentals. Build big theories about it. very dangerous to take a position on these otherwise true statements. But when it comes to timing and it comes to elasticity, it becomes very dangerous.
Just to add one comment to that, the dollar is already up quite substantially over the past year.
Against the euro?
Against the euro, but on an indexed basis against its major trading partner currencies as well. I think it's up about at least 6% on the dollar index, something of that order. So that has caught a lot of people, apart from my patrons, by surprise. And it's going to be nothing compared to what will happen next year with the US dollar. Mark our words.
You're on record.
What do you mean by that, Sam?
The extent to which the US dollar will rise next year against the expectation of very many.
And against paper currencies, not against gold.
Yeah, against other paper currencies.
Okay, so you're saying the dropping, it's not the Americans going to rise, the others going to drop significantly.
Much more.
So gold will stay pretty much.
I think gold will actually increase more so in non-dollar terms next year. We've been given the signal.
I think we should break for lunch if we want to have a reasonable amount of time to eat. And please join me in thanking Sandeep and Professor Fekete.